Thank you, May Britt. Our third speaker is Arn Keeling. Arn Keeling received his PhD in geography from the University of British Columbia. He's currently an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland. His research and publications focus on environmental historical geography of Western and Northern Canada and studies of domestic and industrial pollution, environmental politics, and the history of the conservation and environmental movement. He was co-investigator on a multi-site, multi-year project examining abandoned mines in Northern Canada and recently launched a project on the environmental history of northern contaminants.
Hi everyone, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I can't hear you anymore.
Okay.
So maybe somebody can give me the high sign when I should start speaking.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good to go?
Can you hear me?
No.
Thanks so much.
Hold on.
No?
No.
Not yet?
Hold on. So as you'll see, Arn is not here with us physically. He's contacting us via Skype, and I just want to mention there were a couple reasons for doing that, but one of which was Arn was concerned about the environmental impact of traveling here to talk to us about environmental problems, and obviously there's lots of decisions one can make on this issue, but we wanted to support Arn in his decision on this issue, and thought it was consistent with the missions of our centers. It's obviously easier to deal with people in person, but we increasingly are going to, I hope, be interacting these ways. So let's hope it works well. And how's our sound now?
Good, I'm hearing you well.
You
I
can
hope
hear
you're
us?
hearing me.
Okay. We can hear you,
Good.
and we'll let you know if we can't.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just somebody just start waving your arms or such things. Thank you very much for, indulging me in a technologically mediated fashion. Which is, of course, yes, both for environmental and practical concerns around getting across the continent in the middle of a teaching semester. Thanks also for the previous two presentations, which I thought set up a lot of the things, or certainly speak to a lot of the things that I want to address today. In the interest of, I guess, clarity and everything, I'm mostly going to stick to a bit of a script, and that will also ideally help me keep to time a little bit. You should have in front of you handouts that relate to a series of short slides that I prepared related to the presentation, so you can, as they say, follow along in your hymnals. This is obviously a very different kind of meeting than the one that I was sort of following virtually as well last week, which was the Arctic Frontiers Conference in Tromsø, Norway, which, as people may know, is a business, science, and political sort of major Arctic networking sort of activity and promotional event that served to promote the issues and the agendas of the region. In fact, this year's theme was climate and energy, and one can almost picture all the stiff upper lips as the delegates discussed the conference theme of, quote, how the Arctic's energy resources contribute to the global energy mix in the decades to come, even as oil plunged below $50 a barrel. But of course, as Elizabeth pointed out, this image of the Arctic as a frontier, a place at the margins inviting exploration and exploitation, has a long history, and the mobilization of this notion at the Arctic Frontiers Conference, even by those representing Arctic places, highlights the persistence and the deep embeddedness of this image in discussions of Arctic science, resources, and societies. A counter to this image of the Arctic as a scientific and resource frontier is one that May Britt Oman very wonderfully elucidated, which is the Arctic as the homeland of circumpolar Indigenous peoples. A contrast also captured in the Canadian context by the famous late 1970s report of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, Homeland or Hinterland. These divergent images of the Arctic are often invoked in contemporary debates over resource development in the region, whether between Nenets reindeer herders and gas developers in Russia, Sami protesters against mining, as we saw, intense debates over uranium development in Greenland, or Inuit encounters with large-scale mineral development in the Canadian Arctic. In these and other settings, large-scale, the discursive construction of the Arctic as a primary commodity frontier or an industrial sacrifice zone increasingly runs up against concrete resistance from Arctic Indigenous peoples intent on defending their rights to land and their abilities to determine their collective futures. The projects that I've been working on over the past 7 years reflect a growing scholarly and community interest in these questions. And I'm going to be using we a lot because I work very closely with a historian as a collaborator here at Memorial University, Dr. John Sandlaw. So the I and the we are somewhat interchangeable in our activities. And indeed, we've had a lot of other sorts of research partners, from students to community members, as we'll discuss. We've similarly tried to get at these issues by working with Indigenous communities in Canada's Northern Territories to document local experiences and perceptions of environmental and social change associated with large-scale mineral development. This work has included oral history, ethnographic, and participatory research methods aimed at exploring, and here you can see the points on your second page there, the connections between resource development and colonial dispossession, the impacts of development on Indigenous resources and practices, the effects of closure and deindustrialization on local communities and environments, and the remediation of ongoing environmental legacies that persist often long after the putative end of extractive activities. Today, what I'd like to do is again, you'll see some connections with the previous presentation, but it essentially is to reflect on some of the ethical, methodological, and philosophical issues in this research, particularly for myself, by contrast with Maybrit, as a non-Indigenous outsider researcher working in these communities, which raises questions of positionality and ethics and Indigenous research, issues of representation and memory related to oral histories, and the relevance of Indigenous knowledge for contemporary debates around industrial development and environmental remediation. So I'll quickly just review where the kind of situated knowledge that I have and experience of this with relation to our project. So if you flip to the map on the next page, you'll see some of the sites and projects that I'll be referring to. Our engagement in community-based northern research began with the Abandoned Mines in Northern Canada project, which aimed to explore the historical impacts of abandoned mines on Indigenous communities in Northern Canada. The goal has been to highlight the social and environmental changes that large-scale mining projects brought to northern communities and the ongoing impact of these mines after they were abandoned. The Indigenous encounter with mining in this region has been poorly documented in the historical record. Although Indigenous people have long worked in and for mines in various capacities, their experience in mining history is usually explored in terms of their dispossession, exclusion, marginalization, and the experience of landscape degradation associated with neo-colonial mineral development in the 20th century. But of course, Indigenous people not only suffered through or resisted, but participated in mineral development, and in so doing became miners. Nevertheless, few studies have used oral history to capture Indigenous people's encounters with development and their experience of mine closure, either as workers or as broader participants in local economic and settlement life. The Abandoned Mines project was subsequently extended to new cases and new questions through an ArcticNet-funded project on adaptation, industrial development, and Arctic communities, which examined both historical and contemporary mineral developments in Canada's Arctic territories and Inuit communities. In the Canadian Arctic, particularly the new territory of Nunavut, the rapid social and cultural changes affecting Inuit people are being accelerated by a growing interest in extractive development. Our project has used both historical case studies and ethnographic methods to explore Inuit attitudes towards and encounters with mineral development in the region. Finally, our historical research into mining and pollution in Yellowknife, the capital of the Northwest Territories, and on your map on there, you'll see it on the north shore of Great Slave Lake, which was, that led to a community partnership-driven project examining the closure and remediation of Giant Mine, a former major gold producer located in the city. The abandoned Giant Mine left 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide buried underground, a residual of 50 years of mineral processing, and now an environmental liability affecting both settlers and Aboriginal people in the region. The controversial remediation proposal to freeze the arsenic underground in perpetuity led to a community university partnership amongst two Canadian universities, a Yellowknife NGO, and the Yellowknife's Dene First Nation, in order to undertake public interest research into the historical, contemporary, and future impacts of what is now one of Canada's worst toxic sites. So now I want to just switch to talking again, you'll be your next page there, about some of the ethical, methodological, and philosophical issues that we've encountered in our practice of community-based research. And I'll mainly focus on the oral history research here. As I noted earlier, our initial motivation for using oral history was one common to many practitioners of this methodology, which is to address the gaps in the archival record and to explore the hidden histories and untold experiences of industrial development in the North. Where Indigenous people are present in the archival record, they appear as objects of state policies around employment, settlement, or interactions with non-native newcomers. Rarely, before the 1970s at least, were Indigenous opinions, reactions, or experiences of development recorded or sought. Our interest in quote-unquote recovering Indigenous experiences with industrial development resonates with one of the core motivations of the oral history movement, which is to record, literally and figuratively, these ignored stories, and thereby to challenge dominant historical narratives. In the process of engaging with communities and individuals over the course of the project, however, some of the perils of this stance became apparent, which prompted, I think, for us a deeper reflection on some of the questions of positionality and knowledge of the sort urged by advocates of Indigenous methodologies, which you heard, again, a little bit about in the previous presentation. Although the communities we worked with and individuals we worked with expressed considerable enthusiasm for documenting their stories, the notion of restoring hidden voices to the public transcript in many ways reflected our outsider status and our interests as Southern white academics. Indeed, it became quickly apparent that the stories of industrial development and environmental damage are far from hidden in the communities themselves. Rather, they continually circulate and are mobilized from time to time in communities' ongoing engagement with land use planning, land claims, and new development proposals. This issue also arose when we returned to communities to report on the results of oral history studies, which sometimes placed us in the awkward position of repeating back to community members their own stories. It became important for us to recognize that the absences in the archival record and the ignorance of Southern Canadians, including scholars, regarding Aboriginal experiences do not extend to the communities themselves. In each of our case study communities, we found that Aboriginal people brought varying motivations and levels of participation and oversight to the research. In some cases, our proposals to study the mining past were greeted with more or less instant enthusiasm, while in other cases, relationship building took repeated visits and discussions over years. In all cases, community engagement with research quite properly reflected their own interest in documenting the past, whether for the purposes of land claims and resource management, potential compensation claims, regulatory processes, or simply the recording for posterity of elders' experiences with mining and the coming of Euro-Canadian settlement. Rather than limiting or biasing the research, I think these goals really helped validate our presence in the community and the purpose of our study, while allowing us more or less free rein to carry out the research as we saw fit. Our activities were also governed, it should be noted, by scientific research licensing bodies in 3 Northern Territories and subject to review by university ethics boards, themselves guided by the ethical protocols of Canadian research funding agencies regarding research with Aboriginal communities. And this has become a very important dynamic and a really, I think, an important part of Northern and Aboriginal research in the Canadian context at the very least. These very formal ethical review and community review practices that go on surrounding virtually any kind of research, but especially research that has a human component. Indigenous oral histories, we've found, can provide important insight into processes and experiences of environmental change associated with mining. As people with lifeways and knowledge systems intimately tied to local environments, Northern Indigenous communities often found themselves bearing the brunt of the environmental changes associated with mining, whether deforestation, local resource depletion due to habitat changes and harvesting by newcomers, or pollution and toxicity associated with mining and mineral processing wastes. Much research into Indigenous knowledge, including oral histories of local environments and environmental change, is typically framed in terms of traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, emphasizing their extensive understanding of biological systems, local geography, and other quote-unquote natural phenomena. Yet the close association of traditional ecological knowledge with the management of biotic resources has meant that its perceived applicability has generally remained confined to a very localized and very traditional understanding of the relationship of Indigenous people to their natural environments, and obscured their knowledge and experience of other aspects of environmental change, including industrial resource extraction. As the anthropologist Julie Cruikshank points out, the association of Indigenous oral history with legend, rather than with documented and thus scientific fact, similarly marginalizes Indigenous knowledge while failing to recognize the nature and authority of orally transmitted knowledge to the local and traditional spheres. Orally transmitted knowledge in Indigenous cultures. In part, to avoid this confinement, our approach focused on individual histories of engagement with mineral development and environmental change in order to explore the sustaining of individual and collective life projects, as my colleague here at Memorial Mario Blazer calls them, in the face of rapid and transformative industrial developments. There's thus, as outsiders and non-Indigenous people, we did not expect to share or completely understand Indigenous knowledge, worldviews, or experiences. We also recognize that because they were speaking to outsiders, interviewees may have chosen to share certain kinds of stories with us, based on the questions we asked. In that sense, we follow Linda Shopes and others regarding oral histories as products of this interaction, rather than objectively collected knowledge. So in this dynamic of co-produced knowledge, the outcomes of oral history research are best regarded in terms of shared authority and negotiated meanings. Our ongoing interpretation and representation of these interviews represents a further layer of mediation between the informant and various audiences, including this one. Shopes suggests that this shared authority is a check on all participants in the oral history process. She writes, scholars do not get to exercise critical judgment quite so forcefully or conform to current historiographical thinking quite so deftly. Lay people do not get to romanticize the past so easily. Now I want to turn to some reflections on the relevance of Indigenous knowledge for questions of environmental remediation. And then we'll be flipping now to the next handout slide there. These reflections on doing oral histories of industrial development have informed our approach to research on Indigenous and community engagements in environmental remediations, particularly at the Giant Mine in Yellowknife. The remediation phase of development projects raises distinct issues with community knowledge, historical experience, and memory, precisely because it addresses the legacies of past extractive activities, rather than the potential economic and ecological impacts of development in the future. Our research on Northern Canada has suggested that the introduction of a major development project can represent a significant, if not the central moment in Northerners' encounters with Southern Canadian expansionism and colonialism, ushering in a series of rapid and at times destabilizing environmental, social, and cultural changes. Contemporary efforts to address abandoned mines or toxic sites, then, may revive these historical conflicts and the sense of injustice associated with the original development and its impacts. These conflicts indeed may be reproduced in material ways as remediation activities raise both immediate and long-term risks associated with the mobilization and or containment of toxic contaminants at abandoned mine sites. These conflicts may also be reproduced at a more conceptual level as Indigenous communities use the remediation process, such as public hearings, consultations, and environmental assessments, as a means to seek redress for historical inequities, particularly the unjust distribution of harms and benefits that accompanied the original mine development. We've come to think of these sites indeed as zombie mines, because in their afterlife they continue to haunt communities with many of the same issues: environmental risks, unequal wealth distribution, decision-making by outsiders that emerged with the original developments. So the Toxic Legacies project that I mentioned earlier has engaged in a community-based research project into the proposed remediation of one of these zombie mines, the Giant Mine in Yellowknife. As noted, this project is very much a research partnership with Northern community groups and individuals contributing to the definition of research questions and to the actual research process itself. Our research activities to date, and this is very much an ongoing project, have included historical research into the impacts of the mine on local communities during its operational phase, contributing to the territorial environmental assessment process of the proposal for the long-term underground storage of arsenic trioxide dust at the site, and contributions to community-driven research and dialogue on how to manage and communicate toxic hazards at the Giant Mine into the distant future, all key issues identified by community partners. A couple of the images that you see on the slide there, I'll just mention, illustrates how they plan to contain the arsenic trioxide dust at Giant Mine underground using a thermosiphon technology, which is actually intending to freeze the rock chambers underground in which all of this arsenic dust is stored, and then use essentially a kind of passive air exchange system that would maintain the rock frozen, thereby mitigating against the mobilization of this arsenic into the environment. And that would entail essentially care for this site in perpetuity. Much like questions of radioactive waste management, this site would have to be managed forever. So that raises profound questions around duties towards future generations, how you communicate these hazards to future generations. And it's certainly of local Indigenous people's interest who understand that they have lived in that territory from time immemorial and have a particular duty and sense of care and obligation to the local landscape, would have particular insights into how this site might be managed and those hazards might be communicated to future generations. So this is some really kind of compelling questions that are being raised here by, again, very much by the communities themselves, and we're helping facilitate some of that research. With respect to some of the questions around the remediation process itself, our examination of the public hearing process and other forums devoted to the issue highlights the shortcomings of efforts by regulators and project proponents to effectively incorporate traditional knowledge and the experience of local Indigenous people into the review process. What regulators understand traditional knowledge to be applicable in the remediation process, usually, as mentioned above, as kind of supplementary ecological data about pre-development condition, sort of stuff about caribou and berries, is for local communities a more broadly defined knowledge base that encompasses an array of social and ecological changes that are embedded in the history of the original mining operation. Throughout the nearly 6-year review and assessment process, the Yellowknives Dene often struggled to have their historical experience of environmental injustice and the cumulative impacts of development acknowledged as a relevant input into the planning process. The narrow scope for the review and the weak inclusion of traditional knowledge in remediation planning reflected the project's orientation towards technical solution and Western scientific modes of knowledge. Nor were the Yellowknives' traditional knowledge of arsenic, its impacts on their health, and the possible additive impact of new arsenic loading into air and water from the remediation project effectively acknowledged. As a result, we argue in a paper that we're working on in revision for a journal publication, we suggest that this review exemplified the difficulty that proponents and regulators have in conceptualizing how traditional knowledge may be applied to an industrial scale remediation project. And I think in the context of this meeting, re-emphasizes why truly community engaged and community-based science and all different forms of research in the Arctic is so critically important. So to just offer a few concluding reflections, which are on your final slide there, or at least next to last without the credits. The standard for relationships between researchers and community members in Arctic and northern communities have shifted considerably in the past couple decades, especially certainly in Canada, and my sense is in other Arctic and northern research contexts as well. It's shifted from a tradition of externally defined, even extractive research, to an ethic of partnership and the co-production of knowledge. While not all projects and individuals have perhaps achieved these goals, and I would certainly not claim that our own projects have always met the gold standard of community-based participatory research, they provide at minimum aspirational targets for the redefinition of community-based science in the Arctic around the needs and desires of Northerners themselves. As my fellow Northern geographer Caroline Desbiens has noted, relationship building and maintenance is a fraught and complicated process, especially for the majority of researchers who are non-Indigenous and based at Southern institutions. Our experience of working with Northern Indigenous communities has taught us much about these challenges, yet the critical importance of engaging Northerners themselves in all aspects of the research process, from conception to production to dissemination. The resulting co-produced knowledge reveals the complex environmental legacies of industrial development in Northern Canada, at least in the context of our project. The stories of individuals and communities' engagements with industrial mining very much disrupt the triumphal narratives of Arctic frontier resource development, while illustrating industrial agency and engagement with socioeconomic and environmental change, helping us move beyond simplistic kinds of impact analysis type research that we see going on, and perhaps addressing some of the issues that Elizabeth raised in her talk around the kind of bifurcation of victim versus triumphal narratives of resource development. And I think these experiences for us also highlight the ongoing environmental legacies and the politics of remediation at zombie mine sites, and indeed at other locations of industrial extraction around the Arctic, and the ways in which that we need to reckon not only with this presumed Arctic resource frontier and the open and the new opportunities for resource extraction that are presented, but with the already century-long history of resource development and extraction that has occurred in the Arctic, and the ways in which that continues to shape Arctic environments and societies today. So with that, I'll leave it. I tried to abbreviate my remarks somewhat because I realized we were running a little over time, and so I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, etc. You will see on the final page, I should just give the usual shout outs to funders. We've enjoyed some very excellent support from funding agencies here in Canada, as well as, of course, the many communities that we've worked in, individuals too numerous to mention in those communities, of course, as well as my scholarly collaborator, John Sandloss, and our many colleagues and students working on these questions with us here at Memorial University and beyond. Thanks very much for your attention, and I hope that transmission was clear enough.